You know, for such an important philosopher, Aristotle got very little scholarly development. Seriously, what little development he did get was mostly done by the Muslims, but that all got destroyed by the Mongols. Funnily enough, the Catholic Church, after spending its early history trying to destroy Aristotle, made a complete 180, and through the work of Thomas Aquinas, practically made Aristotelianism its dogma. But dogma is the key word there, since that meant Catholic philosophers weren't allowed to develop it. So I guess the point I'm trying to make is that I feel comfortable skipping several thousands of years of philosophical history to talk about one of the only philosophers who took Aristotle's ideas and actually developed them. So you can call me Ezekiel. This is Ayn Rand. Let's jump in. Ayn Rand was born in 1905 as Elissa Rosenbaum in the Russian Empire, St. Petersburg. If you know anything about history, then you'd know that her childhood would give her a front row seat to both World War I and the Russian Civil War that followed. During that Civil War, her family fled to the White Army-controlled Crimea. But after the Reds won the war, the family returned to St. Petersburg, where she later attended university. This time living under a real communist regime would prove foundational to Ayn Rand's worldview, as they shaped her into a fierce anti-communist. It was those anti-communist ideas that would influence her philosophy, Objectivism. But that would still take some time, because after university, Ayn Rand traveled to America, which she fell in love with instantly. So while she was only supposed to stay temporarily, she managed to obtain residency, and later, citizenship. Now free in America, Rand performed various jobs in Hollywood while also writing novels on the side. Eventually, that writing career would pay off when she published her breakout work, The Fountainhead. This was followed years later by the even more successful Atlas Shrugged. During this time, she surrounded herself with some of her newly minted followers, including future Federal Reserve Chairman Alan Greenspan. However, after a lifetime of practicing philosophy, a combination of age and heavy smoking took their toll on her, until eventually, in 1982, she died. Although in 1991, her ghost made a quick reappearance to take the Soviet Union down with her. Now, as far as the lives of philosophers go, that's pretty good. She even became famous within her own lifetime, which is pretty much the grand prize for philosophers. So I'd rate that life with at least 3.5 Karl Marxes, or over 400 Giga Nietzsches. So now that we understand the woman who created Objectivism, we can talk about it. So, if I could describe Objectivism in a sentence, it would be, in Objectivism, if you aren't talking dollars, you should at least be talking cents. But seriously, here's how it breaks down. Shit's real, yo. Use your brains, stupid. Get a job, hippie. Hippity hoppity, get off my property. And if you think Atlas Shrugged is better than Fountainhead, you're going to a work camp. Actually that last one might just be me. This philosophy doesn't allow for work camps. Anyway, let's get into what all this means. First, of course, is metaphysics. Ayn Rand's Objectivism holds that our one and only reality exists, and does so independent of man's consciousness. The technical term for this is objective reality, which is where the philosophy gets its name. Now, this sounds very similar to Aristotle's metaphysics, and that's because it is. Rand's greatest philosophical influence was Aristotle, although they do still differ in a few key ways. Perhaps the greatest is over God, because, whereas Aristotle definitely believed in some sort of deity, Objectivism is atheistic. Epistemologically, Objectivism holds as an axiom that man's senses are valid, and that man's mind turns the information of our senses into valid concepts. Furthermore, we can create new concepts out of existing concepts. This is pretty much pure Aristotle, so I would like to add an interesting extrapolation that can be made from this epistemology. Now, most atheistic philosophies are materialistic. That's to say, they hold that there's nothing other than material reality, and that consciousness is just a meaningless byproduct of that material. However, since Objectivism holds that consciousness is real, but also clearly not material, Objectivism is not a materialist philosophy. Instead, there's both material and consciousness within reality. And now, ethics. Rand's ethics remain extremely similar to Aristotle's, but she did make some important changes. You see, Aristotle's ethics were kind of arbitrary. This is because he crafted his system by observing what the best men around him did, and extrapolating ethics from that. Rand, on the other hand, wanted a more idealistic basis, so she started with a single premise, that man should live the best life possible to him by pursuing happiness, or in other words, egoism. Furthermore, and just like its Aristotelian influence, Objectivism holds that the best way to pursue happiness, eudaimonia, is through inculcating virtue. Now, in ethics, all egoism means is that man should pursue his own interest, but that doesn't tell you how to find out what your interests are. This means that different egoists can have radically different approaches to life. A great example of this comes in the form of one Marquis de Sade. And yes, that is the man for whom the word sadism is named, so you know this is gonna be bad. The Marquis de Sade was an egoist. More specifically, he was a libertine. In his seminal work, The 120 Days of Sodom, his protagonists kidnap a series of mostly underage victims of both sexes. They then proceed to commit nearly every vile atrocity possible upon them for their own pleasure. And I'll tell you right now, whatever you're thinking they did way worse. Both Rand and Aristotle would consider these actions to be completely and totally unethical. And yet, all three of these people were egoists. So why are their ethics so different? The answer is quite simple, and a great example of how lower levels of philosophy influence higher levels. You see, epistemology is on a more fundamental level than ethics, so even if you're an egoist, you still need epistemology to tell you what's actually in your interest. The Marquis de Sade is a little hard to pin down epistemologically, but I can at least say that he seems to put a high epistemological value on feelings and urges. So if you feel the desire to commit an atrocity, then it's clearly in your interest, and thus good to do it. But Rand and Aristotle believed in reason for their epistemology, and reason can't justify committing atrocities as a way to achieve happiness. This is because reason must be consistent, and there's basically nothing you can say to justify harming someone else that doesn't also justify harming you. So whatever you gain by committing atrocities against others, you more than lose by allowing others to commit atrocities against you. And now, finally, politics. And it's here that we fully break with Aristotle. Because while Aristotle barely had anything to say on the matter, Rand is quite famous, or some would say infamous, for her take on it. Objectivist politics can most easily be understood as minarchist or libertarian. However, Rand would have objected to those labels. Why? Well, ask yourself this. What's the difference between an objectivist and a libertarian? The answer is that whereas libertarianism is only a political philosophy, objectivism covers all of philosophy. This means that libertarianism has no ethics in of itself. So let's give a practical example with cannabis. Both an objectivist and a libertarian would agree that cannabis should be legal, but they disagree on what to do after. You see, a libertarian may very well hold this belief just because he wants to be free to abuse the stuff. Meanwhile, an objectivist would find recreational use and abuse of drugs to be stupid and immoral, only wanting it to be legal because he thinks that banning it should not be within the purview of government. This also means that to objectivists, libertarians come off as self-destructive degenerates, while to libertarians, objectivists come off as moralizing hardasses. Or in other words, a great setup to a sitcom. But while this does explain what objectivist politics isn't, we still need to find out what it is. Objectivism holds that since man, not government, is the only being capable of reason, then the only valid structure for society is one that puts the control of man's life in his own hands. That system is the free market. This is because force is fundamentally anti-reason, and free markets naturally arise when no one is using force, making free markets the only valid political structure. In fact, objectivists support the free market so much that Rand once described them as radicals for capitalism, and she meant that as a compliment. Although, we're still left with the question of what to do with those who do initiate force, or what to do if two otherwise reasonable men have a dispute. And this is where the government steps in, because its role is to control the police, the military, and the courts. I would like to note that this is totally distinct from an American conservative argument in favor of capitalism. You see, American conservatives, usually due to religion, are quite skeptical about the morality of markets. They only support them on the grounds that they work so well that it would be foolish to get rid of them. Objectivists, on the other hand, hold the nearly opposite view. They think that capitalism is the moral system, while the fact that it works is just serendipity. In fact, objectivists find the American conservatives' defense of free markets to be immoral and self-destructive. As far as they're concerned, the conservatives are agreeing with the socialists that capitalism is morally wrong. In philosophical terms, the conservatives are surrendering ethics to their opponents in favor of politics. But since ethics is more fundamental than politics, the conservatives are just sowing the seeds of their own destruction. Now, all of this begs the question, has there ever been an objectivist country? The answer to that is, kind of. The early United States was very close to an ideal objectivist country, but with two major exceptions. The first is that slavery in the South and Jim Crow in the North were anathema to objectivism, which considers slavery and racism to be both morally reprehensible and irrational. The second issue is that the early United States would have been way too religious to be considered objectivist, which, remember, is an atheistic philosophy. But other than that, the early United States was very close, and Rand considered the Founding Fathers to be nearly perfect objectivist men. So after listening to all this, you're either thinking, wow, this philosophy sounds great, maybe it's even the one for me, or, oh my god, that's awful, how can anyone believe in this trash? Well, whether it's to learn more about it, or just because you want to debunk it, I've got book recommendations. So if it wasn't obvious from the beginning of this video, I don't think Atlas Shrugged is a very good book. It has nothing to do with my opinions on this philosophy. Just judging it as a piece of literature, it's really bad, which is surprising because it's the far more popular and influential of Rand's two major novels, the other one being The Fountainhead, which, in my opinion, is really good. Again, this has nothing to do with my views on objectivism. Just judging it as a piece of literature, it's a very fun book. So for those of you who enjoy fiction, I'd highly recommend The Fountainhead over Atlas Shrugged. However, for those of you who prefer nonfiction, or who like their books shorter than 700 pages, then I have some much more concise nonfiction picks. The first is Philosophy, Who Needs It? It's a collection of essays by Rand covering all aspects of her philosophy, but it also includes an explanation of philosophy itself in the titular essay. If you only have to read one of these books and don't like fiction, then this would be it. Next is Introduction to Objectivist Epistemology. Now, between the title and the cover, this sounds like the most boring book ever written by anyone ever, but it's actually fascinating. I particularly enjoyed a section that discusses language and the exact nature of diction and grammar. And my two final picks are The Virtue of Selfishness, which covers ethics, and Capitalism, the Unknown Ideal, which discusses politics. And that's Ayn Rand's Objectivism. So after that, I think we've talked enough about philosophy for a while. So up next is something completely different. I'll see ya then.